My stepfather said adopting a black child would ruin his reputation at the country club. His own father left everything to me instead. My stepfather Douglas had been playing dad for 12 years. Every school play, every basketball game, every parent-teacher conference. He'd walk into those meetings with his hand on my shoulder, introducing himself as Jamal's father to anyone who'd listen. His co-workers at the accounting firm thought he was father of the year, taking on a kid that wasn't even his. What a saint. Douglas loved that narrative. He'd built his whole identity around being the generous white man who stepped up. His golf buddies at Oakwood Country Club ate it up. "You're a better man than most, Doug." Not many guys would raise another man's child. He'd just smile and shrug like it was nothing. The kid needed a father figure. I couldn't just stand by. Mom died when I was 22. The cancer took her fast, 3 months from diagnosis to funeral. Douglas held my hand at the cemetery, tears streaming down his face. "You'll always be my son, Jamal. Blood or not, you're mine." The adoption papers had been sitting in his desk drawer for 5 years. Mom had begged him to make it official before she got sick. Douglas always had an excuse. The timing wasn't right. The lawyer was too expensive. The paperwork was complicated. After Mom passed, I brought it up at dinner one night. Douglas was cutting into his steak, telling me about his promotion to senior partner. I waited for him to finish, then pushed the folder across the table. "I found a lawyer who'll do the adoption for free. She says we can file next week." Douglas didn't even look at the papers. He kept chewing, then took a long sip of his wine. Finally looked up at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Pure disgust. "Jamal, we need to have an honest conversation here." I nodded, thinking maybe he was emotional about Mom. "You're 22 years old, a grown man. Why would I adopt you now?" I explained what the lawyer had told me. It would make things easier for inheritance, medical decisions, all the legal stuff that comes with family. Douglas started laughing. Not a chuckle, but deep belly laughter like I'd told the best joke he'd ever heard. He wiped his eyes with his napkin. "Oh, Jamal. Sweet, naive Jamal. You actually thought I'd put my name on legal documents claiming a black kid as mine?" My stomach dropped. "What? Do you know what that would do to my reputation? My standing at the firm? At Oakwood?" He leaned forward, suddenly serious. "I maintained a certain image all these years because your mother was alive. But legally binding myself to you? Having that on permanent record?" He shook his head. "That was never going to happen. I played the role when it benefited me. Your mom was grateful, my colleagues were impressed, everyone thought I was progressive. But adoption? That's permanent. That follows you forever. But you said I was your son." Douglas rolled his eyes. "It's called charity, Jamal. I gave you a roof, food, education, sent you to college. What more do you want? A piece of paper that destroys my social standing? You think the partners at my firm want to see a black kid as my beneficiary? You think Oakwood members want that in their community?" I felt my hands shaking. "So, 12 years was just an act?" Douglas shrugged. "I did more than most would. You should be grateful for what you got. But expecting me to legally claim you?" He laughed again. "That's just entitlement." 2 days later, Douglas's father Harold called me. Harold had been in assisted living for 3 years, barely conscious most days according to Douglas. Except Harold was completely lucid on the phone. "Jamal, I need you to come see me. Bring a lawyer if you have one." I drove out to Golden Acres that afternoon with the adoption lawyer. Harold was sitting up in bed, sharp as ever. Douglas had been lying about his condition for years. Harold had his own lawyer there, along with 2 nurses as witnesses. "I've been watching my son for years," Harold said, "pretending to be confused so I could see his true nature. What he did to you, how he treated your mother when he thought no one was looking, the racism, the cruelty, the performance of it all." Harold pulled out a thick envelope. "This is my new will. Douglas gets nothing. Not the house, not the investments, not the family business. It's all yours, Jamal. You've been more of a grandson to me than he's been a son." The lawyer confirmed everything was legal and ironclad. Harold had been documenting Douglas's behavior for years. Every racist comment at family dinners he thought his father couldn't hear. Every time he called me charity case when explaining why I couldn't come to certain family events. Douglas showed up at Golden Acres the next morning. Harold was waiting with security. The nurse told me Douglas went pale when Harold spoke clearly for the first time in 3 years. Douglas's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up fast, his face going red like he couldn't breathe right. Stanley kept talking in his calm lawyer voice, explaining how Harold had been awake and aware for 3 full years, watching everything Douglas did and said. Douglas grabbed his coat off the back of the chair and shoved his arms through the sleeves so hard I thought the fabric would rip. He didn't look at me or Harold or anyone else in the room. He just turned and walked out, and the door slammed so hard behind him that one of the nurses jumped. I sat there frozen in my chair, my hands gripping the armrests like they were the only solid things in the world. Harold was watching me with these tired but sharp eyes, and I realized he'd been waiting for this moment for years. Mercedes came over with a small paper cup of water and set it on the table next to Harold's bed. She had this sad smile on her face when she looked at me. "I've been working here for 2 years," she said quietly. "Your stepfather visited every month like clockwork. Always made sure to sign in at the front desk where everyone could see him being the good son. But when he thought Harold was asleep or too confused to understand, he'd say things. Terrible things about you, about your mother, about how much he resented having to keep up appearances." She glanced at Harold, who nodded slowly. "I documented everything I heard," she continued. "The dates, the times, what he said word for word. Harold asked me to write it all down because he knew Douglas would try to claim this was all fake or made up." Mercedes reached over and squeezed Harold's hand gently before she left the room to give us privacy. Stanley pulled his chair closer to the bed and opened his briefcase. He took out this massive folder, the kind that's so stuffed with papers that the edges bulge out. He set it on the rolling table next to me and flipped it open. The first thing I saw was a typed transcript with dates going back almost 3 years. My eyes caught random phrases as I skimmed the first page. Charity case. Good for my image. Temporary arrangement. Never meant to be permanent. My stomach felt sick. Stanley started pulling out more documents, organizing them into neat piles on the table. "These are transcripts of conversations Harold recorded when Douglas thought he was alone in the room," Stanley explained. He pointed to another stack. "These are photographs from family events where Douglas specifically were excluded you from important family photos or gatherings. And these," he tapped a third pile, "are witness statements from country club members who heard Douglas refer to you as temporary charity or his wife's project." I picked up one of the photos and recognized it immediately. It was from some business dinner 2 years ago, right after Douglas made partner. Everyone was dressed up fancy and there were maybe 30 people in the picture. Douglas was front and center with his arm around some senior partner, both of them smiling huge for the camera. I wasn't in the photo. I remembered that night because Douglas had told me the dinner was partners only, no family allowed. But looking at the background of the picture, I could see other partners' kids scattered throughout the group. My hand started shaking holding that photo. Stanley kept going through the folder like he was presenting evidence in court, which I guess in a way he was. "Here's documentation of times Douglas told club members you were just staying with him until you finished college," Stanley said. "He has you categorized as a temporary dependent, not family. And here are the financial records showing he never added you to any insurance policies, never listed you as a beneficiary on anything, never took the legal steps that actual parents take for their children." Harold was watching me look through all this evidence, and he looked completely worn out, but also kind of peaceful. Like he'd been carrying something heavy for years and finally got to set it down. "I waited until I had enough proof that no court could question it," Harold said, his voice rough and quiet. "I needed Douglas to hang himself with his own words and actions. I couldn't risk him talking his way out of it or convincing people I was senile and you were manipulating me. So I played confused and barely conscious while I watched him show his true self over and over again." His hand reached out toward the folder. "Every racist comment he made at family dinners when he thought I couldn't hear. Every time he complained to his friends about having to deal with his wife's black kid. Every instance where he made it clear you were a burden he tolerated for appearances. I documented all of it." Stanley confirmed that everything was legal and couldn't be challenged. Harold had medical records from 3 different doctors, proving he'd been mentally sharp the whole time, just pretending to be confused so Douglas wouldn't hide his real personality. I drove home about an hour later with that thick folder sitting on the passenger seat next to me. It must have weighed 2 or 3 pounds, just paper and photographs and recorded proof that the last 12 years of my life had been a performance. The folder kept sliding around every time I turned a corner, and I finally had to put my hand on it to keep it still. My mind felt blank and buzzing at the same time, like when you stand up too fast and everything goes fuzzy for a second. I kept replaying Mercedes's words about Douglas visiting Harold regularly, but saying awful things when he thought no one could hear. Kept seeing that photograph of the business dinner where everyone's family was included except me. The drive home took maybe 20 minutes but felt like hours. When I pulled into the driveway, Douglas's car was already there, parked at this weird angle like he'd been in a hurry. I could hear his voice before I even got the front door open. He was screaming at someone on the phone, his words all running together and echoing through the house. I walked in and followed the sound to his study. The door was half open, and I could see him pacing back and forth with his phone pressed to his ear. Papers were scattered all over his desk, and some had fallen onto the floor. He'd knocked over his desk lamp, and it was lying on its side with the light still on, making weird shadows on the wall. Douglas saw me standing in the doorway, and his whole face changed. He ended his phone call without saying goodbye, just hung up and threw his phone onto the couch. "You manipulated him," Douglas said, his voice shaking. "An old man who couldn't defend himself. You poisoned him against his own son. You're a thief who destroyed my family to steal what's rightfully mine." He picked up a coffee mug from his desk and threw it against the wall. It shattered and left a brown stain running down the paint. How long have you been planning this? How long have you been working on him behind my back? Douglas was breathing hard like he'd been running. You played the victim so well. Poor Jamal. No father, no family. So grateful for everything I gave him. And the whole time you were manipulating a sick old man to cut me out of my own inheritance. I set the folder down on the table by the door and just stood there looking at him. My voice came out way calmer than I expected when I finally spoke. I had no idea about Harold's plan. I'm just as shocked as you are. Douglas laughed, but it didn't sound like he thought anything was funny. It sounded mean and bitter. Oh, please, he said. You expect me to believe you didn't know anything? That you just happened to visit him with a lawyer right when he decided to change his will? You played the long game perfectly. The grateful charity case who never asked for too much, who was always so appreciative. You stole my inheritance right out from under me, and you did it so smoothly I never saw it coming. He kicked his desk chair and it rolled backward and hit the bookshelf. Douglas was still talking, saying I'd destroyed his relationship with his father, that I'd ruined his reputation, that everyone would think he was a terrible person now. But all I could think about was that folder sitting by the door, full of proof that he'd been saying horrible things about me for years while pretending to be my father. Douglas walked right up to me, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. You have 3 days to get out of my house, he said. I won't have a thief living under my roof. Pack your things and find somewhere else to stay. 3 days. Then I'm changing the locks. I looked him right in the eye and kept my voice steady. According to Harold's will, this house is mine now, along with everything else. The house, the investments, the business, it all belongs to me. Douglas's face went from red to almost purple. His mouth opened, but no sound came out for a few seconds. Then he started yelling again, louder than before, saying I was lying, that I'd forged documents, that his lawyer would destroy me in court. I just picked up the folder and walked past him to my room. I could hear him behind me, still yelling, his voice following me up the stairs and down the hall until I closed my bedroom door. I called Jasper around 10 that night after Douglas finally stopped raging and left the house. Jasper answered on the second ring, and I explained everything that had happened at Golden Acres. He asked me to read him specific sections from the will document Stanley had given me. I could hear him typing on his computer while I read, probably looking things up or taking notes. When I finished, Jasper was quiet for a minute. Then he said, okay, this is actually ironclad. Harold left you the house, which is worth probably close to $1 million based on the neighborhood. He left you his investment portfolio, which according to these documents is approximately $3 million. And he left you his share of the family accounting business, which means you now own the majority stake in the company Douglas runs. Jasper kept talking, explaining that Harold had structured everything to be legally bulletproof. Douglas could try to contest it, but he'd lose. The will was witnessed properly. Harold had medical documentation proving he was competent, and there were multiple people who could testify that Harold made these decisions freely, without any pressure or manipulation. The next morning I woke up to silence. The house felt empty in a way it never had before. I got up and walked down the hall to the bedroom Douglas had shared with my mom. The door was open and the room was half empty. He'd taken all his clothes from the closet, cleared out his side of the bathroom, removed the photos he kept on the dresser. The bed was unmade and there were empty hangers scattered on the floor. I found a note on the kitchen counter, just a piece of paper torn from a notepad. It said his lawyer would be contacting me about contesting the will and that I'd regret stealing from him. That was it. No signature, nothing else. I folded the note and stuck it in the folder with all of Harold's documentation. My phone rang while I was making coffee, and I saw Stanley's name on the screen. Douglas's lawyer already reached out to me, Stanley said when I answered. He's threatening to challenge the will on grounds of undue influence. Claims you manipulated Harold when he was vulnerable and not thinking clearly. Stanley didn't sound worried at all. In fact, he sounded almost amused. Harold anticipated this exact response. That's why he spent 3 years documenting everything. I have medical records from 3 different doctors confirming Harold's mental competency throughout the entire period. I have witness statements from facility staff. I have recordings of conversations that prove Harold made these decisions independently based on Douglas's own behavior. If Douglas wants to take this to court, he'll lose and it'll cost him a lot of money in legal fees. Stanley told me to forward any communication from Douglas or his lawyer directly to him. Don't engage with them yourself, he said. Let me handle it. This will is solid and Douglas knows it. He's just angry and looking for someone to blame. I spent most of that day sitting at the kitchen table going through every page in Harold's folder. The transcripts were the worst part. There were dozens of conversations Harold had recorded over the years, all typed up with dates and times. I found one from 2 years ago where Douglas was talking to his golf buddies after a round. The transcript showed Douglas laughing and saying that raising me had been good for his image at the firm, made him look progressive and generous. But he said he couldn't wait for me to graduate college so he could stop pretending to care. Said he'd done his duty to my mom's memory, and once I had my degree, he could finally stop playing dad. Another transcript from about 18 months ago had Douglas talking to someone at the country club about membership policies. Douglas was complaining that they were considering letting in more diverse members. He said he'd already done his charity work raising a black kid, and he shouldn't have to deal with them at the club too. Reading his exact words, seeing them typed out on paper with dates and witnesses, made everything feel more real and more horrible at the same time. My phone rang around 10 that night. Mercedes's name showed up on the screen. I answered, and she asked how I was holding up after everything with Douglas. Her voice sounded tired but kind. She said she needed to tell me something that Harold had wanted her to share. I sat down on the couch and waited. Mercedes explained that Harold had talked about my mother a lot over the past 3 years. He loved her deeply, she said. When she married Douglas, Harold thought maybe his son had finally found something real. But then he watched Douglas treat me like a prop while my mother was alive. After she died, it got worse. Harold told Mercedes he felt sick watching Douglas perform grief at the funeral, while privately complaining about being stuck with me. Mercedes said Harold cried sometimes when he talked about it. He felt like he'd failed my mother by not seeing who Douglas really was until it was too late. The will was his way of making things right. I thanked her and hung up. The house felt too quiet after that call. 2 days later, my phone rang again. This time it was Cornelius from Golden Acres. He sounded stressed. Douglas had shown up at the facility about an hour ago, demanding to see Harold. Security tried to explain that Harold wasn't taking visitors, but Douglas pushed past the front desk. Cornelius and another guard found him outside Harold's room, pounding on the door and yelling. Douglas was screaming that Harold had betrayed him, that changing the will was going to destroy his reputation and his life. He kept shouting that Harold had no right to ruin everything he'd built. The other residents were getting scared. Security had to physically escort Douglas out of the building. He was still yelling accusations when they walked him to his car. Cornelius wanted me to know in case Douglas tried to contact me. I told him to call the police if Douglas came back. That evening, Mercedes called again. Her voice was different this time. Shaky. She said Harold's condition had declined suddenly about an hour ago. The doctor wasn't sure what caused it, but Harold was asking for me. I grabbed my keys and drove to Golden Acres, going 20 over the speed limit the whole way. When I got to his room, Harold was in bed with oxygen tubes in his nose. His skin looked gray. Mercedes stood near the door and nodded at me. I sat in the chair next to the bed and took Harold's hand. His eyes opened and he looked at me. His voice came out weak and raspy. He said he'd held on long enough to make sure Douglas couldn't hurt me anymore. That my mother would have wanted someone to protect me. That he was sorry he hadn't done it sooner. I told him it was okay, that he'd done more than enough. Harold smiled a little and closed his eyes. His breathing got slower. Harold died around midnight. I was still holding his hand when it happened. Mercedes came in to check on him and put her hand on my shoulder when she realized. Harold's last words before he went were that he was proud to leave everything to someone who deserved it, someone who loved his daughter for real, instead of using her memory as a performance piece. I sat there for another hour after he passed. Mercedes didn't rush me. She just pulled up another chair and sat with me in the quiet. The funeral happened 3 days later at a cemetery across town. I wore the only suit I owned. Douglas showed up with his lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit who kept whispering to him. They sat in the back row. Douglas stared at me through the whole service. His face was red and his jaw was tight. Several people from Golden Acres came. An older woman named Ruth stood up and talked about how Harold used to show her pictures of me. She said he kept them in his room and told everyone I was his grandson, that he was proud of me for finishing college. Another resident shared a story about Harold talking about my mother, how much he missed her, how glad he was that I reminded him of her. Douglas's face got redder with each story. His lawyer put a hand on his arm like he was worried Douglas might stand up and start yelling. After the service, there was a reception at a restaurant nearby. Douglas and his lawyer stayed in the corner. The accounting firm partners came over to offer their sympathy. 3 men in dark suits who looked uncomfortable. One of them, a guy with gray hair and glasses, shook my hand and said he was sorry for my loss. He asked how I was doing with everything. I could tell they were confused. They kept glancing at Douglas across the room. They still saw him as the generous man who raised his wife's son. The gray-haired partner asked if I needed anything, if the firm could help with arrangements or estate matters. I thanked him and said I had it handled. He nodded and started to walk away, but then turned back. He mentioned that he'd heard Douglas was dealing with some estate complications, asked if there was anything they could do to help the family. I told him it was all being taken care of by Harold's lawyer. The partner looked relieved and walked back toward his colleagues. I noticed Douglas watching our conversation from his corner. His hands were clenched at his sides. His lawyer was still talking to him, but Douglas wasn't listening. He just kept staring at me with this look that was part anger and part fear. Stanley called me the following week and asked me to come to his office. The building was downtown in one of those old towers with marble floors. His office was on the 15th floor with windows overlooking the city. Stanley had papers spread across his desk. He explained that we needed to start the estate transfer process. Then he told me something I hadn't known. Douglas's share of the family accounting business wasn't actually his. Harold owned it. Douglas had been operating as managing partner for years, but the ownership structure was different from Douglas claimed. Harold had left me a controlling interest in the firm, 65%. Douglas only had 30%. The rest was split among junior partners. I sat there trying to process what Stanley was saying. He explained it again. I was now Douglas's boss. Douglas had been running the firm thinking he owned the majority, but Harold had structured everything to prevent Douglas from pushing him out or taking full control. Douglas had no idea. He'd been operating under the assumption that he'd inherit everything when Harold passed. Stanley said Harold was smart about it. He set up the structure so Douglas would keep running things day to day, but never have enough power to make major decisions alone. Now all that power was mine. A few days later, the estate executor called, a woman with a professional voice who asked what I wanted to do about the house. Douglas was still living there. Technically, the property belonged to me now, but removing him required a formal process. She could file eviction paperwork if that's what I wanted. I thought about Douglas giving me 3 days to get out after my mother died. How he'd laughed when I asked about adoption. How he'd called me charity. I told the executor to give Douglas 30 days to find new housing. She paused and said that was generous considering the circumstances. I said I knew. She said she'd send the formal notice by the end of the week. The formal letter arrived 3 days later. Douglas's lawyer sent it certified mail, demanding I vacate the house immediately. The letter claimed Douglas had more right to the property since he lived there with his wife for over a decade. I called Jasper and read him the whole thing over the phone. He laughed and said he'd handle it. 2 hours later, Jasper sent a response with property deeds showing Harold bought the house outright in 1998. Douglas had never owned it. Harold just let him live there. The lawyer never responded after that. I spent the next week going through Harold's business records in boxes Stanley had delivered. The accounting firm's internal documents were eye-opening. There were complaints from junior partners about Douglas's management style going back 5 years. One partner wrote that Douglas took credit for client acquisitions he had nothing to do with. Another complained that Douglas blocked promotions for anyone who questioned his decisions. A third mentioned that Douglas's billable hours didn't match the work he claimed to complete. The firm's reputation was solid, but Douglas's personal standing was shakier than he let on. My phone rang while I was reading through a particularly harsh performance review. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard a woman's voice asking if this was Jamal. She said her name was Marlena and that she worked at Golden Acres as Harold's physical therapist. She said she had something important to show me. Could I come by that afternoon? I drove out to Golden Acres right after lunch. Marlena met me in the lobby and led me to a small office near the therapy rooms. She pulled out a leather-bound journal from her desk drawer. Harold had given it to her the week before he died with instructions to give it to me after the funeral. I opened it and saw Harold's handwriting filling page after page. The journal documented every interaction Harold had with Douglas over the past 3 years. Dates, times, exact quotes. Douglas visited twice a month like clockwork, always on Sundays around 2 in the afternoon. Harold wrote down everything Douglas said when he thought his father couldn't hear. The entries were brutal. Douglas complained about having to visit. He told someone on the phone that the assisted living fees were draining his inheritance. He made racist jokes about other residents, and he talked about me constantly. One entry from 18 months ago made my hands shake. Douglas told Harold directly that adopting me would damage his standing at Oakwood Country Club, that his golf buddies already questioned why he kept me around after Mom died, that making it legal would be social suicide. Harold wrote in the margin that this conversation was when he decided to change his will entirely. I thanked Marlena and took the journal home. That night I couldn't sleep, so I kept reading. Harold's notes showed a pattern. Every time Douglas visited, he performed for the nurses and staff. He'd speak loudly about being a devoted son, about how hard it was watching his father decline. Then the moment he thought Harold was unconscious, the mask dropped. He'd complain about wasting his Sunday. He'd check his watch constantly. He'd take phone calls about golf tee times. Harold documented all of it with the precision of someone building a legal case. 3 weeks later, the 30-day notice period ended. Douglas hadn't moved out. I had Stanley send an official eviction notice. A sheriff's deputy delivered it to the house while Douglas was at work. That made it real, legal, public. Douglas called me that night screaming about humiliation. I didn't answer. His lawyer called Stanley the next day trying to negotiate. They offered to let me keep the investments if Douglas could have the house. Stanley rejected it immediately and reminded them I owned everything. Douglas had no leverage. 2 days before the legal deadline, a moving truck showed up at the house. I watched from my apartment as Douglas's belongings got loaded. He supervised the movers with his phone pressed to his ear. His lawyer made one final attempt that morning, calling Stanley to propose a cash settlement. Stanley hung up on him. By evening, the house was empty except for the furniture that came with it. Douglas left his key on the kitchen counter with no note. I moved back in the following weekend. Walking through the rooms felt strange. This was the space where I grew up, where Mom died, where Douglas told me I was charity. But now it was legally mine. No performance required, no gratitude expected. I started small, replacing things that reminded me of Douglas. New curtains in the living room, different art on the walls. I painted the guest room that used to be mine a color I actually liked. Each change made it feel less like somewhere I was allowed to stay, and more like somewhere I belonged. The country club manager called 3 days after I moved back into the house. His voice was smooth and careful when he asked if I had time to discuss Harold's membership. I told him I could meet that afternoon. He suggested his office instead of the main building. That told me everything about how awkward this was going to be. I drove to Oakwood at 2. The manager sat behind his desk with a folder in front of him. He explained that Harold's lifetime membership transferred to me automatically as part of the estate. Several members had approached him with questions. Douglas had been talking to people, saying I manipulated Harold, saying I took advantage of a sick old man. The manager asked if I wanted to address the situation directly or simply resign the membership to avoid conflict. I looked at him for a long moment. Douglas wanted me gone from every space where his reputation mattered. That was exactly why I needed to stay. I told the manager I'd keep the membership and attend the spring gala next week. He nodded slowly and said that was my right. His expression suggested he thought I was making things harder than necessary. The gala was Saturday evening. I wore the suit Harold bought me for my college graduation. Walking into the main hall felt strange. I'd been to Oakwood exactly twice before. Both times, Douglas made excuses for why I couldn't come inside. Said the club had strict guest policies, said it wasn't worth the hassle of getting me approved. Now I owned his father's membership, and he couldn't do anything about it. Several older members approached me right away. They offered condolences about Harold, said he was a good man, asked how I was holding up with everything. I thanked them and kept my answers short. Across the room, Douglas stood with his usual golf group. His face was red and his jaw was tight. He stared at me like I'd walked into his house uninvited. One of Douglas's golf buddies broke away from the group. He walked over with a drink in his hand and introduced himself. Said he'd heard about the inheritance situation, asked what really happened because Douglas's version didn't make much sense. The man's tone was friendly, but his eyes were sharp. He wanted gossip. I kept my voice calm. Told him Harold made his own decisions based on what he observed over the years. Said Douglas could explain his own behavior if people had questions. The golf buddy went back to his group. I watched them talk. Douglas's face got redder. One of the men glanced at me, then back at Douglas. Another one shook his head. Within 20 minutes, the whole room felt different. People kept looking between me and Douglas. Conversations got quieter when Douglas walked past. His carefully built image as the generous father figure was cracking in real time. A woman approached me near the bar. She said she remembered my mother. Said she always wondered why Douglas never brought me to club events after she died. Her tone suggested she was putting pieces together that didn't look good for Douglas. I thanked her for the kind words about Mom and moved to a different part of the room. Douglas left early. I stayed until the end of the gala. By the time I walked out, several more people had asked about Harold's decision. Word was spreading fast. Douglas's reputation was built on performance, and it was falling apart now that people questioned what really happened behind closed doors. The accounting firm partners called Monday morning. They requested a formal meeting to discuss the ownership transition. I met them Tuesday afternoon in the main conference room. 5 partners sat around the table. They stood when I entered and shook my hand. Their faces were professional but confused. They clearly didn't know what happened between Douglas and Harold. The senior partner asked about my plans for Douglas's role at the firm. His voice was careful. I said I had no plans to interfere with daily operations. I'd be reviewing firm performance and management practices, but they should continue as normal. One partner looked relieved. Another glanced toward Douglas's office down the hall. The tension was obvious. The meeting lasted 30 minutes. When I walked out, Douglas was waiting by my car in the parking lot. His face was red and his fists were clenched. He started yelling before I got close. Said I destroyed his life. Everyone at the firm was asking questions. Everyone at the club wanted to know what happened. His reputation was ruined because of my greed. I stood there and let him finish. Then I told him the truth. I didn't ruin his reputation. He did that himself by being racist and using me as a prop for 12 years. Douglas looked genuinely confused. Said he gave me everything. A home, education, opportunities. I should be grateful instead of destroying him over paperwork. Douglas requested a private meeting at the firm 2 days later. Jasper told me not to go. Said Douglas would try to manipulate the situation. I went anyway. I needed to see if Douglas actually understood what he'd done, or if he still thought this was about money. Douglas sat in his office overlooking the city. He looked smaller somehow, defeated. He asked what I wanted from him to make this go away. His voice was tired instead of angry. I sat down across from him and said I didn't want anything. Harold gave me what he thought I deserved. Douglas got what he earned through his own choices. Douglas argued that he raised me, said he deserved gratitude. His voice got stronger, like he was convincing himself. He still didn't understand that performance wasn't the same as love. That showing up to basketball games while refusing to make things legal wasn't being a father. I explained that real family doesn't keep adoption papers in a drawer for 5 years. Doesn't refuse to make things legal because of country club reputation. Doesn't call someone charity behind their back. Douglas looked genuinely shocked, asked how I knew about his private comments. His face went pale. I pulled out Harold's journal, the one Marlena gave me with direct quotes from 3 years of documented conversations. Douglas tried to claim he was joking with his golf buddies, said I was taking things out of context, said he did love me in his own way. His voice got desperate. I opened the journal to a marked page, read his own words back to him. The conversation where he told Harold that adopting me would damage his standing at Oakwood, that his golf buddies already questioned why he kept me around after Mom died. Douglas went completely pale reading the date and exact quote. He couldn't deny it anymore. I closed the journal and looked at Douglas. His face was white. He tried to speak, but nothing came out at first. Then he said Harold was senile when he wrote that. I shook my head and told him the medical records proved Harold was completely aware. Douglas slumped back in his chair. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. I stood up and walked to the window, looked out at the city below. Then I turned back and told Douglas he could stay at the firm in his current role if he wanted. But I'd be watching how he treated people. His authority as managing partner was now conditional on his behavior. Douglas looked up at me with pure shock on his face. He started to argue but stopped. His shoulders dropped. He nodded once, quick and sharp. He knew he had no leverage anymore, no way to fight back. I left his office without another word. Over the next month, I met with Stanley almost every week. We went through Harold's estate piece by piece. Harold had been far wealthier than Douglas ever knew. There were investment accounts Douglas never heard about, real estate holdings in 3 states, stock portfolios that had been growing for decades. Stanley showed me documents proving Harold made smart choices with his money, while Douglas thought his father was just getting by on his pension. Harold had hidden his wealth on purpose, wanted to see what Douglas would do without expecting a big inheritance. Every meeting with Stanley revealed something new. A trust fund Harold set up years ago, bonds that matured quietly, investments in companies that grew huge over time. Douglas had no idea any of it existed. I used part of the money to set up a scholarship fund at my college, named it after my mom. The fund would help students who lost parents, kids who needed support to finish school. It felt right using Douglas's expected inheritance this way, honoring the woman he used as a prop for his reputation. The college was excited about the donation. They put my mom's name on a plaque in the financial aid office. Every year, the scholarship would help 3 students, kids who understood what it meant to lose family and keep going anyway. The junior partners at the firm started coming to me with concerns, things they never felt comfortable telling Douglas. One partner told me Douglas took credit for a major client deal she closed. Another said Douglas blocked his promotion twice because he felt threatened. A third partner showed me emails proving Douglas redirected bonuses meant for junior staff to his own accounts. Every conversation made Douglas's character clearer. He wasn't just racist. He was cruel to anyone he saw as beneath him. The partners seemed relieved to finally talk about it, like they'd been holding their breath for years. I made changes at the firm, reduced Douglas's authority over promotions and bonuses, created a review board so junior partners had a voice, set up direct reporting so people could raise concerns without going through Douglas. Douglas complied with everything, signed off on every change, but he barely spoke to me anymore. When we passed in the hallway, he'd nod and keep walking. In meetings, he was cold and professional. His resentment was obvious in every interaction. His jaw stayed tight. His answers were short. He did exactly what was required and nothing more. 6 months after Harold's revelation, I was settling into my new life. Real financial security for the first time ever. A clearer understanding of who actually cared about me. Jasper became a real friend instead of just my lawyer. We grabbed lunch sometimes, talked about things besides legal documents. I started building other relationships too. People who valued me for who I was instead of how I made them look. The weight of performing gratitude was gone. I could just exist without wondering if I was being enough for someone who saw me as charity. Douglas's reputation at Oakwood kept declining. More people learned the truth about how he treated me. Members I'd never met came up to me at club events, said they were disappointed in Douglas, that they thought he was better than that. One older member told me he'd known Harold for 30 years. Said Harold was a good man who wouldn't have done this without serious reasons. Douglas became more isolated each week. His regular golf group stopped inviting him. People avoided sitting near him at club dinners. I saw him eating alone more than once. A letter arrived from Douglas 3 weeks later, handwritten on his personal stationery. He wanted to meet for coffee, said he wanted to apologize and explain himself. I stared at the letter for a long time. Part of me wanted to throw it away, but I was curious if Douglas was actually capable of real reflection, or if this was another performance. I called him and agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, somewhere neither of us had history. Douglas was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He looked older somehow, more gray in his hair, lines around his eyes I hadn't noticed before. I sat down across from him. He pushed one coffee toward me. Then he started talking, said he did care about me in some way, that it wasn't all fake, but his fear of judgment poisoned everything. His obsession with reputation destroyed any chance of real connection. He admitted he knew it was wrong even while he was doing it. But he couldn't stop himself from choosing his image over actual relationships. He asked if there was any chance we could rebuild something, any kind of relationship at all. I looked at him and told him honestly that I needed time. Time to figure out if that was even something I wanted, if it was possible to build something real after 12 years of performance. I left the coffee shop and walked to my car. Douglas's apology felt somewhat real, more honest than anything he'd said to me before. But it didn't erase 12 years of being used as a prop for his image. 12 years of thinking I had family when I was really just part of his reputation strategy. I was building a real life now, people who valued me for who I actually was, not for how I made them look to their golf buddies or work colleagues. Harold gave me more than money. He gave me the truth, the freedom to choose my own path forward instead of being grateful for scraps from someone who saw me as charity instead of family. I drove home knowing I didn't owe Douglas anything. Not forgiveness, not a relationship, not even my time. Whatever I decided would be for me, not for him.